Welcome to the EPG Pathshala's linguistics course. I'm Prabal Das Gupta, handling the morphology and syntax paper of this course, within which in this module we shall look at auxiliaries and affixes. The objective of this module is to begin to crack the auxiliary system which we have kept on hold throughout the paper, about which we have told you earlier that we are keeping it on hold because it is particularly difficult. We begin by noting that when a clause in English does not carry present or past tense, when it is not a finite clause, we find that it carries some other kind of marking, non-finite marking. For example, if you say, to make mistakes is human, to forgive is divine. The clauses to make mistakes and to forgive are infinitival clauses. If you say making mistakes is human, forgiving is divine, the clauses making mistakes and forgiving are gerundial clauses. The infinitive to make or to forgive and the gerund forgiving or making are syntactically very similar, although they are morphologically different. Morphologically, forgiving and making have an inflectional affix on the verb, whereas in the case of infinitives, morphologically forgive and make are bare verb stems with nothing on them. And the infinitive feature is expressed by the auxiliary to on the left of the verb. Syntax finds it easier to assume that there is a tense node responsible either for present or past tense which are finite, or for the non-finite parts of the tense spectrum. Syntactically speaking, gerund and infinitive are values on that spectrum, just as present and past are values. Present and past can be called plus tense. Infinitive and gerund fall within minus tense, but minus tense is part of the spectrum, just as singular and plural number are both part of the number spectrum. Therefore, we propose to say that the difference between to forgive and forgiving, although it is really salient in the morphology, cannot be quite as salient in the syntax. In the syntax, we have to treat forgiving and to forgive as consisting of a tense node in the syntax followed by a verb node. The tense dominates the element to in the infinitival form to forgive. In the gerundial form forgiving, we have to assume in the horseshoe model of the standard theory of generative syntax that the tense is a volatile version of ing, call it x-ing, which works with the morphological marking in on the verb forgiving to make sure that the semantic interpretation comes out right. In the surface structure, of course, this x-ing becomes invisible. The way to look at it is tense fusion. The tense element fuses into the word giving, so that in the surface structure x-ing is absent. But in the deep structure it is present and can be seen to be syntactically parallel to the tense element to. Remember that minus tense is a kind of tense, just as minus plural is a kind of number. Just as we don't restrict the term number to plural number, but also apply it to singular. In the syntax of auxiliary elements and affixes, we don't restrict the syntactic node tense only to the plus tense values, present and past, but we also use it for the minus tense values, gerund, infinitive, and participle. So far we have spoken about gerunds and infinitives. Let us now move to participles, another type of non-finite clausal structure with corresponding non-finite material under the tense node. Consider sentence 3. The man riding a bicycle is Susan's brother. Riding a bicycle in the deep structure must have a subject of the clause co-referential with the man. The subject is the volatile ex he. It must also have a volatile tense ex ing, which will fuse into riding, leaving you only with riding in the surface structure. Likewise, sentence 4, all decisions communicated by this office are final, starts out in the deep structure with the embedded sentence, the participial clause, containing a volatile subject ex de, co-referential with all decisions, and with the volatile tense ex n, which is going to fuse into the verbal word communicated. Why do we write ex n instead of ex ed when communicated ends in ed? We are following here a convention of generative syntax. The convention comes from words like taken and given, which are participles and which are maximally different from the way the past tense looks. So it is easier to use xed for the past tense and xen for the participle in order to keep them different in English. When you compare sentence 5, the man is riding a bicycle, with sentence 6, in which the volatile elements ex he and ex ing are not shown in the deep structure, you find that there are two different analyses we are considering for the string the man is riding a bicycle. We are asking whether, as in 5, we should show it with the participial clause he, ing, riding a bicycle being somehow applied to the man is, or whether, as shown in 6, we should treat is as an auxiliary that belongs to the verbal complex of riding, so that the special apparatus of the participial clause does not have to be used. How do we choose between these two analyses? How do we decide whether riding a bicycle in the man is riding a bicycle does or does not qualify as a full participial clause with a subject of its own and a separate tense marking of its own? If we compare the progressive participle with the perfect participle, we find that the perfect participle in English cannot be used in a separate participial clause that modifies an NP. If the man has ridden a bicycle does not allow ridden a bicycle to be treated as a participial clause with a separate subject and a separate tense marking for this reason, then we conclude that the analysis we are postulating for the man has ridden a bicycle must also apply to the progressive form the man is riding a bicycle. We therefore conclude that the ing in riding a bicycle gets licensed in a sentence like the man is riding a bicycle not by tense fusion from a separate tense marker ex ing, but by the auxiliary be. The auxiliary is in the sentence the man is riding a bicycle. Is takes the responsibility of licensing the progressive participle. In English, forms of the verb have take responsibility for licensing perfect forms, and forms of the verb be, such as is or am, take responsibility for licensing progressive forms in the verbal complex. In case you didn't get the point, let us repeat the core of what we are saying. The non-finite marking ing on riding, which is progressive, the non-finite form en on ridden, which is perfect, gets licensed by the auxiliary to its left in the English verbal complex. Thus, in the man is riding a bicycle, is licenses the participial ending on riding. The man has ridden a bicycle, has licenses the en on ridden. In contrast to participial clauses where the licensing is done by a separate tense element. Having taken a look at affirmative sentences, sentences of positive polarity, we now begin the examination of negation, which is one of the hardest parts of the auxiliary problem in English. In English, we can say 11a, Ali is not staying for dinner, but we cannot say 11b, Ali is staying not for dinner. Likewise, we can say 11c, Ram has not bought the bicycle, but we cannot say 11d, Ram has bought not the bicycle. Slightly more intricate are the facts of 12, where 12a is all right, Juan has not been coaching athletes. But the ill-formed sentences 12b, Juan has been not coaching athletes, and 12c, Juan has been coaching not athletes, places the negation in the case of B after the auxiliary been but before the verb coaching, and in example C after the verb coaching. What we find if we scrutinize these examples is that negation must be placed after the first auxiliary if there is a sequence of two auxiliaries, or after the only auxiliary if there is exactly one auxiliary in the structure. To cut the long story short, negation in English is placed after the first auxiliary, because you can say the first auxiliary even if there is no second auxiliary. The syntax of negation becomes one step more intricate when you compare it with emphatic affirmation, which is the polar opposite of negation. For example, if you say 13, Ali is staying for dinner, or 14, Ram has bought the bicycle, this is an emphatic opposite of Ali is not staying for dinner or Ram has not bought the bicycle. Now, just as not is associated with the first auxiliary if there is a sequence of two auxiliaries, likewise emphatic affirmation, when it sees a sequence of two auxiliaries, gets attached to the first and not to the second. Thus you get Juan has been coaching athletes. You cannot say Juan has been coaching athletes. Juan has been coaching athletes is ungrammatical. When you look further into the details of negation, you find that there are two versions of every negative sentence. One version of the kind we've been providing with the full negative word not. Another version where that negative word is shortened or contracted into what is known as a clitic nt, as in hasn't or isn't. An element is called a clitic when it is halfway between a full word and an affix. So nt in isn't Ali staying for dinner, in hasn't Ram bought the bicycle, or in hasn't Juan been coaching athletes, is a negative clitic attached to the first auxiliary in the complex. There is one respect in which emphatic affirmation is closer to the clitic version of negation than to the full-blown word version of negation. If you consider what happens when the material travels by virtue of a transformation moving it, you find that one says hasn't Juan been coaching athletes, where hasn't moves out of hasn't been to the left of Juan. You don't say hasn't been Juan coaching, you say hasn't Juan been coaching. Now when you look at the emphatic affirmation obviously travels with the auxiliary. So you get has Juan been coaching athletes, which is exactly comparable to hasn't Juan been coaching athletes. Notice that the full-blooded word not doesn't travel with its auxiliary. You say has Juan not been coaching athletes. You do not say has not Juan been coaching athletes. In this respect, there is a difference between the full word not and emphatic affirmation. Why? Because emphatic affirmation obviously cannot be left behind when an auxiliary moves to the left. There is no way that the auxiliary can move while leaving its stress behind. The stress goes with the word. So does the clitic. So far we have artificially restricted our discussion to examples where the auxiliaries express aspect, the have auxiliary expressing the perfect aspect and the be auxiliary expressing the progressive aspect. We now want you to look at mood, which as you recall is expressed in English by modals or modal auxiliaries, words like may, might, will, would, can, could. As in examples like 19A1, John may have been paying attention, 19A2, John might have been paying attention, and other examples that are being displayed for you, 19A, B, and C. As you can see in the alternation between the 1 and 2 members of each pair of examples here, the alternation between present may and past might, present will and past would, present can and past could. The modal auxiliary carries a tense marking, present or past. The question is how to reconcile the data of such sentences with a very simple clause like David ran away, where there appears to be no modal auxiliary. You might want to say, at first sight, that in David ran away there is no modal at all. The difficulty with saying that is that you don't have a good account of the question variety in which John may have been paying attention comes out as may John have been paying attention, which exports may to the front of the clause, and where David ran away comes out as did David run away, where run loses the tense element and what goes to the front of the clause is did. Do is a default or dummy modal auxiliary which is doing the duty here of bearing the tense marking in the question construction to the left of the subject, David. This suggests that there is a modal present in every sentence when there is no substantive modal present such as may or might or can or could. There is a dummy modal present, do, in the initial structure, which is ready to take up the slack when it is necessary to move to the left of the sentence, carrying the tense with it. That is what is happening in did David run away. Did fulfills the responsibility of bearing the tense marking. This suggests to us that it is necessary to postulate a modal in every English clause. in every English finite clause, every clause that carries present or past tense. We are not, of course, saying that there are modals in participles or gerunds or infinitives, which are non-finite clauses, where the value of the feature under the tense node is minus tense rather than plus tense. We are talking here about finite clauses. If you follow the impulse of postulating a modal do and a tense past in the syntax of the deep structure for David ran away, so that the deep structure becomes David, tense, the node dominates the element past, modal, the node dominates a volatile x do, ran away. If you take David T past mx2 ran away, exhibit 23, to be the deep structure for David ran away, it becomes possible to carry out tense fusion and get the right results, provided that you delete the volatile modal x do at the right point of the derivation. What we are doing in the verbal system looks exactly like what we did for adjectives in the case of deriving the surface structure taller from the deep structure x much taller. If you compare x much taller with past x do ran, you see that point for point, the degree element xer is like the tense element past. The quantifier element x much is like the dummy modal element x do. And the comparative adjective taller is like the past tense marked verb ran. In this particular context, x much is volatile, but elsewhere we have seen the robust comparative counterpart more, whereupon xer fuses into more and gives you more intelligent. That is comparable to the question form, did John run, where tense fusion is into the non-volatile modal did, so that you get did John run. That corresponds to more intelligent. In other words, there is a direct point-for-point analogy between our analysis of the comparative construction and our analysis of the English verbal auxiliary system. Let us now look at a set of question examples that will help us to determine what happens when there is more than one auxiliary in the picture. Did John run away? Might John run away? Are simple examples. Consider examples like, what is the question for John has been running away? Could John have run away? It turns out that from John has been running away, one says, has John been running away? One does not say, has been John running away. We show this in exhibits 24E and G. Likewise, when there is John could have run away, we question that by asking 24F, could John have run away? We do not ask 24H, could have John run away? In other words, we never move two auxiliaries to the front. We move the first member of the auxiliary set to the front of the sentence if we are asking a question. The questions we have considered so far are of one particular type. They are called alternative questions. The popular term people frequently use is yes-no questions, because they often elicit a yes or no answer. In addition, there are constituent questions, sentences where a particular constituent is being interrogated, such as why did John run away, where why is the interrogative constituent. You can run through the entire set that we have considered earlier and attach a y at the beginning, and you will get all the data that we got last time. In other words, the syntax of alternative questions and the syntax of constituent questions are identical, except that in constituent questions, the WH constituent, as we usually term the question constituent, appears to the absolute left of the sentence, even before the fronted modal or other auxiliary. The process that moves the auxiliary to the left of the subject is called subject-auxiliary inversion or subject-aux inversion. The process that moves a WH constituent to the front of the sentence, even further to the left than the fronted auxiliary, is known as WH movement. You will recall that in an earlier module, in the context of discussing positive polarity items and negative polarity items, we pointed out to you that negative polarity items appear not only with negation, but in affective contexts, an idea that we did not try to define precisely, though we gave some examples. It turns out that many of the affective contexts also trigger subject-aux inversion. Not only questions, but other affective contexts do this. Thus, in addition to interrogative sentences like, did John run away for any reason that you know about, where any is a negative polarity item that occurs because questions are one kind of affective context, you also get, only in extreme situations would David agree to any talk of compromise. In this sentence, example 27c, you find that the affective environment created by only in extreme situations, triggers two special effects. One special effect that we have discussed in that earlier module is that it triggers the choice of the negative polarity item any. Notice that we are saying only in extreme situations would David agree to any talk of compromise. The second special effect is that the only phrase, only in extreme situations, triggers subject auxiliary inversion, would appears to the left of the subject. It is premature for us at this stage to do anything with the syntax of subject-aux inversion in the context of cyclic transformations and root transformations. But it would be very unfair to you if we did not inform you at this stage that subject-aux inversion is one of those root transformations and does not take part in the transformational cycle. This is something you will learn about in detail in a later module when we consider root transformations in the context of the English auxiliary system. Surely you see that we have only begun to scratch the surface of the difficult problems of the English auxiliary system. We are not pretending that in this module we have covered it completely. We will continue to chip away at it until you understand the English verbal complex and how it interacts with constructions such as interrogation and negation. But we have said enough to allow you to begin to grasp the level of difficulty that the English auxiliary system poses to syntactic analysis, and you will begin to appreciate why we kept it on hold until such a late module in our paper, even though many other teaching systems try to show the learner how to handle the English auxiliary very early in their teaching of generative syntax. I believe your experience would have shown you that it is possible to learn English syntax or a syntax course focused on English without tackling the auxiliary system at a very early stage of the game. Surely you find that in the handling of several topics that you have been learning about prior to this module and the immediately preceding module, where we began to take up the problems of the English auxiliary system, there was no difficulty in setting aside the details of the auxiliary while other parts of the syntactic structure were being clarified. If you have had a good experience, then that will encourage writers of syntax courses to follow this example and start with easy parts of the subject and postpone difficult parts of it for treatment later in the course. It is time to summarize what we have tried to do in this module on auxiliaries and affixes. We are trying to show that the inflectional affixes in the English verbal system are consistently licensed by an auxiliary. Nowhere in the English verbal system do you see a single affix that works on its own without licensing from an auxiliary node to its left. All the examples we have seen so far where a verb carries an inflectional affix give you an inflection licensing auxiliary node to the left of that verb. This is the reason why in earlier modules we sometimes show you an auxiliary node that appears to be unmotivated by any surface material. For example, when we were talking about reflexives, you may remember that we suddenly introduced an auxiliary even in ordinary present tense verb sentences like John loves Mary or John shaves himself. We introduced the auxiliary because, as you now see, the present tense auxiliary appears under the T node, the tense node, and is a compulsory part of the verbal complex. You can't have an English verbal complex without an auxiliary, even in apparently simple sentences where there appears to be only one inflected verb on the surface. That was really the main point of this module. Everything else was an elaboration. We elaborated exactly how participles, gerunds, and infinitivals are to be handled. We showed you the difference between participles that appear in a clause where there is a separate subject and a separate tense marker licensing the participle inflection on the verb, and participles that take part in the expression of aspect in a verbal complex where the participle is licensed not by the tense but by an auxiliary of the be or have type. We then took you into the behavior of these auxiliaries under negation and under its polar opposite called emphatic affirmation. We elucidated the contrasts between full negation and the use of a negative clitic. We then proceeded to look at how these things behave under interrogation in two types of questions, and we placed questions in the context of other affective contexts, bringing in negative polarity items to drive our point home. That was all in this module. We hope that we have continued to read the e-texts and to follow the supplementary reading suggestions. And we hope that if you have any feedback to offer, you are sending it to the system and are waiting for responses which will come to you in due course. Thank you for your attention.